Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast on emerging doctrine and the Army's vision of warfare. Hello, I'm Major Scott McMahan. Today we're going to talk about the recent 2025 revision to FM30 operations. While this revision was minor and it did not change the Army's operational concept, there are some important elements to capture and discuss. Some of those changes we'll discuss today include expansion on the tenet of convergence, special operations and conventional force integration, operations in nuclear environments, and a brief comment on ADP 3.0, which was also released at the same time in March. Joining me today to talk about these updates are two of my fellow team members on the FM30 writing team, Mr. Matt Farmer and Mr. Brian Goings, both retired Army officers. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Scott.
So we released the 2022 version of FM30 with a pretty clear understanding that doctrine comes to life post-production during what we call implementation. And, that's kind of what happened here between 22 and 25. As the Army and our partners put into practice, they experimented with it, they shared their experiences. We really learned a lot. And those lessons from unit training, ongoing operations in the world, observations, guidance from senior leaders led us to refine and really expand on the original 2022 version. So our first topic, convergence, I really think embodies that. And just for everybody, convergence is one of the Army 4 tenets of operations, and it's defined in ADP 3.0 as an outcome created by the concerted employment of capabilities against combinations of decisive points in any domain to create effects against a system formation or decision maker, or in a specific geographic area. But our feedback from the force definitely told us that this term was actually one of the most misunderstood ideas in multi-domain operations. So in this new update for 2025, we refine how we explain the term, add a new graphic, help people visualize it a little better, and add a vignette to give people a historical example of convergence in action. So guys, I'd like to first talk about why convergence needed to be refined, at least in terms of how well it was described. Gentlemen, could you talk a little bit about the initial reception and confusion about convergence in 22 and how that shaped these updates?
It was a mixed reception. Some leaders understood it, but then you had other leaders and other organizations that we briefed that did not have a clear understanding of convergence. And there were some common misperceptions that we identified. One was associating convergence with mass. Convergence is about attacking combinations of decisive points. Mass is you're focused on a single decisive point. Another misconception that we saw was units were believed that if you achieved convergence, you defeated the enemy force. That is how you won the battle. And that's not the case. Convergence, the way we explain it in doctrine, is a way to create an opportunity so that you can attack the enemy force and ultimately defeat that enemy force. Another common misperception that we saw was regarding what your lower tactical echelons are doing during convergence. There was this misunderstanding that your divisions and brigades had to wait until the Corps achieved convergence before they could conduct operations. And that's not the case. That's not what we explain in the doctrine. The division or brigade combat team, they are conducting operations as part of the Corps fight. Whether they're a part of the convergence effort or not, they're still conducting operations. And the fourth misperception that we were seeing, several individuals were associating convergence with only space and cyberspace capabilities. And what we stress in the doctrine is a commander's got to use all capabilities available, not just space and cyberspace. So this is where your land forces come into play. How is that commander using land forces? How is he enabling those operations with the space and cyberspace capabilities? How is he using air capabilities? So that's what we stress in the doctrine is the commander's got to use all available capabilities to accomplish a mission and to achieve convergence if that is the case.
So one more thought about convergence, if you don't mind. you're not really creating new ideas in doctrine. You're most often just recultivating old ideas for the current time. And so I think if you view convergence as recultivating an old idea, something that units have been doing for a long time, but for the present day, for the challenge of the current day of having to attack enemy capabilities that are not vulnerable, at one decisive point, and how do you create opportunities against a threat that you're evenly matched with, then I think it's a lot easier to understand what we're trying to get after with convergence.
So we discussed a number of challenges with the idea of convergence and with this new update. What we've really tried to do is help the reader understand what convergence looks like. And to do that, we added this updated graphic in a brand new vignette. And starting off with the graphic, Brian, could you talk about some of the initial feedback we got on the old graphic and then the improvements we've made on the new one?
There was a mixed reaction to the graphic. Some thought it was an oversimplification of operations. Others thought it was too complicated. So we looked at all the feedback, and this is one of those cases where the feedback we received from the force is huge. It helped us see gaps that we had in this depiction, gaps in the convergence material. So we looked at it, and some of those issues that the force brought up was, what unit is orchestrating convergence? How is time depicted on your graphic? How is a unit attacking multiple decisive points? And what is the relationship between the individual effects that a unit is trying to achieve? And by individual effects, I mean the simultaneous, the sequential, and the enduring effects. And then where is this opportunity supposed to happen? So we began looking at how do we make this graphic more abstract to address those specific points. And that's what we ultimately landed on, was every graphic has a theme. And for this one, think of a prism. So that's why we put the core in the center. The core is pulling capabilities from, or using capabilities from higher echelons. It's using capabilities from the subordinate echelons. And it's focusing that combat power at multiple decisive points against an enemy force. And we wanted to depict a cohesive enemy force. So we had this puzzle piece. In fact, it was General Beagle that helped us with the puzzle piece during our iterations with him. It was, if you look at the center of the graphic that is currently in the 2025 version, you've got an enemy force with the puzzle piece around it. The core is attacking multiple decisive points on that. And then over time, you're creating simultaneous, enduring, and sequential effects. And it's breaking the cohesiveness of that enemy force that gives you an opportunity to exploit.
Yeah, I know all three of us had different experiences. We kind of tested the graphic in various FM30 training briefs to very different organizations, to include our international partners. And the reception was generally positive. Matt, any thoughts on developing the new graphic?
We kind of sometimes get in trouble with the graphics because we want to make them simple. We kind of have this mantra of, all models are wrong, some are useful. We want to make the graphics simple so that they can be understood by people who are still, learning the profession, but they're going to appear linear. They're going to appear overly simplistic, right? We know that. The model has to be applied with judgment to the real world, which is complex, and we know. But if we tried to put complex graphics in the manuals, then they wouldn't be easily understood. And so that's kind of the tension that we're running into. And so please don't read or interpret the graphics too rigidly, or any of the models too rigidly. We say kind of in the beginning that doctrine has to be applied with judgment, but it's worth reinforcing because sometimes I think confusion is the result of overly rigid interpretations of what we're trying to say. So use the model to the degree that it's useful, and then I think it's a good thing. Like if you look at a chart and you're like, well, this model doesn't account for X, Y, or Z. Yeah, good that you understand that, and then you can develop a more detailed, nuanced understanding on your own.
There's a new vignette, and when I heard about it at first, I was kind of skeptical. I'm like, hey, it's got to be space and cyber, right? And so you briefly touched on, hold on a second, conservative employment of all capabilities available to you. Can you talk about the new vignette in Chapter 3 on convergence?
Yes. So we looked at several different operations, but ultimately we landed on Operation Postern from World War II. This had all of the elements that we were looking for. The U.S. and allies were facing a large determined enemy force. the enemy force was contesting the U.S. and allies in all domains of that era. And due to the lack of resources and due to the fierce determination of the enemy force, the allies had to attack against multiple decisive points in order to create an opportunity.
Thanks for clarifying that. So we covered a lot on convergence so far. Matt, don't want to leave anything on the table. Is there anything we missed?
I would make 3 more points. The first one is one of the things that some found confusing about the 2022 version was that this idea of combinations of decisive points. If you're of a certain age and you went to FM 390, you might remember it saying once upon a time that there's 1 decisive point per echelon per operation. And that's not been in doctrine for a while. I mean, it's true. And the lower the echelon you're at, the more likely it is you'll have maybe 1 decisive point per operation per echelon. But joint doctrine for over 10 years now has talked about multiple decisive points and identifying them. And a decisive point is just a marked advantage. It can be the adversary is going to have some, and so the friendly force is going to have some too. And maybe some of those decisive points often overlap, right? But we wanted to clarify that. So the 2025 version is going to kind of flesh that out a little bit more and talk about what we mean by combinations of decisive points, that they can be in any domain. They can be really in any dimension. They can be key events. They can be locations, nodes. They can be types of operations. There's really no limit to how we're going to conceive of decisive points. And then we want to relate those decisive points to our advantages and the enemy's advantages too. And so all those factors weigh into how we figure out what the decisive points are. And then at the outset of an operation, whatever the combination of decisive points is going to be, the priorities that the commander has, it's kind of like a hypothesis. And you start operating, and if you're not getting the effects that you want to get, then you sort of have to try a different approach to your combination of decisive points. The second point was, I think people are too also confused, because as a tenet of operations, convergence is kind of like one of these tenets is not like the others, right? The other ones, agility, depth, and endurance, they are all things that we can look into our own operation that we're doing at our echelon and take actions to make those characteristics more present. But convergence isn't one of those, especially if you're not at that senior Army tactical echelon, often a core in large-scale combat operations. But I think, as we thought about it, we recognize that from the beginning, and many people pointed that out to us, that it's not the same. But I do think, as we've kind of thought about this and the idea's maturing a little bit, you can view convergence as how well is my operation contributing to the broader, the higher headquarters operation up 2 levels. And we've had that in doctrine a long time. Like, you've got to understand the mission and intent 1 level up and 2 levels up. But we really kind of need to crystallize that and really view, every leader needs to view their unit as part of this broader picture. And not just that, but what do you need from the higher echelons in order for you to do your job? You hear a lot of football coaches saying do your job, right? And then make a play. When the ball's flying through the air and you happen to be there because you're doing your job, go make a play. And so I think that mindset can be part of multi-domain operations, and specifically to convergence. What is it? What's my job? How am I going to do my job here? And how am I going to make a play? And then what do I need from the rest of the force for me to be successful? And then communicating that up and down and with adjacent units. And then, so for people who say convergence doesn't apply to my echelon, think about it a little bit more in those terms and have that mindset. And then the last thing I would say is, we don't think we have convergence exactly right yet. People bring stuff up all the time that we're taking into consideration. There are dozens of ways to get a hold of us. And so, this is not the end of doctrine, and we want to keep maturing these ideas as we go forward, especially as we continue to modernize the force. We're going to have new capabilities. We're going to create new advantages for our formations. How do all of those things become part of what we're bringing to bear against the threat? So that would be my kind of closing comment.
For the listeners, Matt was really the lead integrator and writer for our SOF and special operations and conventional forces integration material. And when I came in, we were just kind of finalizing that and making sure that community was good with what we wrote through the limited staffing with them. Matt, now that we published, how do you think it worked out?
Yeah, when we did the 2022 version, we tried to eliminate some redundancy. And what happened was we felt like some redundancy between a lot of the language about RSOF roles in large-scale combat operations. And so what ended up happening is you had sort of just a reduced amount of references, right? And people took notice of that. And what we when we look back at it, we thought, yeah, we missed the boat on having a robust enough discussion about soft roles in large-scale combat operations. And more importantly, the mutual support that is possible between special operations forces and conventional forces. And so it was actually the Mission Command Center of Excellence SOF advisor. We kind of pulled together all the SOF personnel across all the COEs. And we had a couple of sessions where everybody kind of talked about what they thought should be included in the material. And then the Special Warfare School weighed in as well. And we kind of kludged all that together and wrote it with the SWIC doctrine writers and kind of came up with some SOF and CF integration material for each of the main chapters on competition, crisis, and armed conflict, and then in generating combat power. And what we wanted to emphasize was the specific advantages that special operations forces have and the specific advantages of conventional forces and how they are complementary and reinforcing in each of the strategic contexts. And so you see that material in there. You see some expanded material on theater special operations commands and special operations joint task forces specifically, and then a little bit less material, but on other special operations echelons and how RSOF are employed through them. And what we're trying to do going forward is just cultivate greater awareness on both conventional forces and special operations forces on what each side brings to the table in the context in which they can be mutually supporting, over the course of joint campaigns. And we'll continue to update it and revise it, where we want to cultivate the idea that soft CF integration doesn't begin on the battlefield, right? That it's a mindset that has to be inculcated during professional military education. You have to start thinking about that as part of your own self-study. It has to be integrated into, and it is, we just need to reinforce it in training, exercises, and mutual understanding of what the capabilities and limitations are on either side.
So if I can jump in here too, your work on the Special Operations Forces Conventional Force integration really made me aware of what we needed to include in all of our manuals. Not only talking about the Special Operations Forces and Conventional Forces integration, but also how does conventional warfare and irregular warfare, how are we using those? And that has carried over into other manuals that I've reviewed. In addition, part of that's been included in how we discuss it and one of the joint publications that we are writing here. But it was that work that made me realize that, hey, we need to make sure that all of our manuals talk about this integration and talk about conventional warfare and irregular warfare. So that's been very useful, at least from my perspective.
So in 2025, we have introduced a new imperative. So now there's 10 imperatives, and that's own the electromagnetic spectrum. And in Chapter 3, it's a relatively small section within the imperatives, but no one can argue today how important the EMS is during operations and in all contexts, competition, crisis, and conflict. So in 22, we had elements of this idea in the account for being under constant observation imperative. But based on unit feedback during our implementation briefs and ongoing conflict, it's very clear it needed to be elevated to an imperative. And for the listeners, just touching back, we were discussing tenets, in particular convergence, which are attributes that should be built into plans and operations. And they relate to how our multi-domain concepts should be employed. But here now we're talking about imperatives, in particular own the EMS. And imperatives are those actions that must be taken, like Matt was saying, and especially at tactical echelons. So owning the EMS is about leaders at all levels actively managing, defending, exploiting the EMS. And making it an imperative kind of reinforces leader ownership and responsibilities of tasks that range all the way from emissions control to deception to complex spectrum management. The EMS can't be an afterthought. It has to be integrated through all aspects of operations.
Yeah, I mean, actually, when we were writing the 2022 version, there were very strong arguments in favor of making the EMS the domain instead of cyberspace even. And the tactical relevance of the EMS, it's really impossible to, I think at this point, to overstate the importance of the electromagnetic spectrum. And, we knew that, and we kind of had the feeling that maybe we didn't emphasize it even enough. I mean, we tried to, but maybe we didn't quite get it emphasized enough. And so there was a recommendation from a retired general officer saying, we should add an imperative called Own the EMS. And we were like, that's a pretty good idea. And we kind of messed around with it. At first, we kind of thought, well, maybe we shouldn't say own the EMS. Maybe it should be like something else, right? Something less difficult to do or more, easier, a little, can we really own the EMS? People say, you can't really own the EMS. And we've gotten that feedback. But I think what the point of that statement was to make a powerful statement, one, but two, there's also this kind of parallel with the idea that we had back in the 90s. And I don't know how far back, maybe it goes back later than that, but own the night, where everybody at every echelon down to the individual level has responsibilities that they have to take ownership of in order to own the night. So, for a private on a rifle squad, you had to make sure that you had batteries for your night vision devices. You need to make sure you put them over your eyes at night, even though maybe that was uncomfortable or it took some getting used to. And for, team leaders had to make sure they knew how to zero the lasers and the optics, and that XOs needed to make sure they had enough batteries on hand and that they were doing the right maintenance on them. They were being stored properly in the arms room and that they were getting all the services. So, and then, all the way up to how we employ forces conduct operations at night when we have the biggest advantage against the enemy. And so that's the way we just want everybody to view the idea of own the EMS. And actually, we didn't add a ton of new material, but we just it was a way of elevating the importance of it and making it just more obvious that it's an important thing.
And that's the feedback that I wanted to give you was when we got the task to let's look at this new imperative. It's okay. How much have we discussed in the 2022 version of FM30? How much did we discuss the EMS? It was there, but when you bring it all together, it highlights the importance. And I think that is where it will benefit the force by bringing all this material together and putting it and making it an imperative.
Yeah, to me, it's just the seed. And we're confident that we can plant the seed in 3.0 in the doctrine, and it will do nothing but bloom. The idea will expand and be very durable and sturdy, and we see it's holding up.
Yeah, I think another idea of this too is I think the combat training centers have done a really tremendous job of helping units see their electromagnetic radiation signatures on the battlefield. We've all seen the kind of picture. It's like, this is this giant like New York City in the middle of the desert. And, how we handle this increasingly transparent battlefield. One, we have to develop a culture of discipline on how we implement electromagnetic emissions control procedures. And very similar to how, when you stop, you dig in. You've got to be continuously managing your electromagnetic spectrum. And it's like, what are we doing with all of our devices? When can people turn those things on and check their social media? And when do they need to be shut down in another location?
I envision it's so easy to integrate into soldiering and hey, soldier, you owning the EMS right now? And you say it kind of flippantly, but it's like, what are you doing with that cell phone? How are you conducting your transmissions? Is this an appropriate pace plan? And then you just keep taking that like, hey, staff, how are we owning the EMS on this? There's just so many directions you can go with it from a integration into training and tactical units. It's kind of a neat imperative, in my opinion.
And it's really difficult because people have become so attached to their connectivity. So we don't want to underestimate the difficulty of this. And that's obviously cell phones is like one of a laundry list of things that have to be considered. But it's also hard because in many respects the EMS is it's invisible, basically, and it's very difficult to put together the consequences of failure in the EMS, right? Like it's harder to visualize that right now. But, we have so many examples in Ukraine and other recent conflicts where somebody was undisciplined with the electromagnetic signature and the battalion got destroyed. So people have to make the connection between that discipline and survival on the battlefield and being able to continue fighting and being combat power.
So in addition to the new imperative of own the electromagnetic spectrum, we also modify two others. The first is protect against constant observation and all forms of enemy contact, which originally was written as account for being under constant observation. And that change again is to protect against constant observation and all forms of enemy contact. A little bit more direct, puts a little bit more emphasis on what you need to do. And then the second is make initial contact with sensors, unmanned systems, or the smallest element possible. Originally, it was just make initial contact with the smallest element possible. So these changes really come from our observations in current conflicts. But the thing I want to point out is that overall, they're pretty modest. I think a lot of people see trends and there's a desire to make it drastic, maybe wide sweeping changes. But I think it's important for people to understand that as we evolve our doctrine, we have to be careful not to draw hasty conclusions based only on experimentation and limited results. FM30 in particular, it has to be right. It must be based on validated principles and used by the force we have today. So I know this is a bit of a tangent from talking about the imperatives, but what are your guys' thoughts on doctrine moving too fast?
Yeah, I mean, this is always a tension in the process of developing doctrine is, when you publish updates, and there's a bunch of factors, and, one of them is, what does the force need right now? And when the force needs something, you just get it as right as you can. If the ideas need to mature a little bit, then you take some time to continue developing the situation and looking at how we're going to validate specific concepts. But there is kind of a limiting factor of we could write doctrine faster in some cases, but we also don't want to churn the force too much. You don't want too many situations in which battalion S3s or the field grade officers are using like a different idea or have a different idea of doctrine than the battalion and brigade commanders. And so there's kind of that's just part of the calculus. I think that the command goes through to make sure we're delivering doctrine on time, but not forcing the entire professional military education system to redo all of their coursework because we changed a few words around. So I think that's kind of the thought process on that.
Yeah, and I'll add my feedback on that question. So we're going to go as fast as our senior leaders want us to go. But the question that I always ask in my mind and internally within the office when we have this discussion is, and this gets to Matt's point, how fast can the force consume doctrine? That's going to be that limiting factor. We can go as fast as the senior leaders need us to, but is the force consuming the doctrine, interpreting, understanding the doctrine, and employing the doctrine?
Yeah, because now you're looking at the schoolhouse is just trying to keep up with those changes. And a really tactical ATP type doctrine should be fairly rapid, right? But if you go too fast, just from a former instructor perspective, like you're either going to miss it, you don't have time to learn it yourself. Yeah,
and you and I have had those discussions about what level of doctrine can we update fast. Is it the Army Techniques publications, which may be able to go a little faster, but your keystone and your capstone doctrine, that should stay fairly consistent over time?
Okay, so getting us back on track, we added material about operations in nuclear environments within Chapter 6. That's the chapter about conflict. And the goal here was to kind of reintroduce material written in the past that had been removed during the War on Terror. And the point of that material is very straightforward, is that Army forces can fight through tactical nuclear weapons. And we reference ATP 372, and that describes very specifically how to do that through training and planning, execution, etc. in one of those changes was an acknowledgement that our pacing and acute threat both have the means to employ tactical nuclear weapons, and then the doctrine to do so, or the rhetoric behind it. So a reintroduction from a 1990s all the way back to post-World War II element of doctrine. And this is a very little seed, and we want to direct the reader to the ATP. But guys, what do you think about that new material there on operations in nuclear environments?
If we don't address it, if it's not part of training and readiness requirements, then our adversaries are going to exploit. It'll be a vulnerability and a weakness that gets exploited. So you have to have it in there. You have to focus on it. We have to be ready for it.
And just another evolution of doctrine, because we worked with the USANCA writers in the past when we developed the 2022 version. We had it good enough. And then as we read it, understood it, as we had the discussions with that team, then we realized we needed to add more. So it's about this evolution. Do we have it right in 2025? We've got it close, but we could always make it better.
It can't be a boogeyman. You can't have, a contaminated environment or a nuclear exchange situation, and we think, oh, well, we can't operate through that. Well, we don't get to choose the environment. We have to be ready for it.
I think 372 does a great job explaining at distance what a detonate. It's not Sarah Connor in the Terminator on the fence getting blasted to pieces. There's ways to protect yourself. Then the second one is not FM30, it's actually ADP30. And so the astute doctrine reader and frequent checker of the APD website will notice that ADP30 has a new publication date of March of 2025 as well. That update reflects changes from the 2022 FM30 as well as the revision in 2025. It adopts multi-domain operations as the Army's operational concept and reorganizes material to articulate the logic from 2022. Something to note, making a reappearance in the ADP is discussion on the theory of victory. Matt, talk doctrinally what the theory of victory is, and then how do we use it in ADP 3.0?
For doctrine, we treat theory of victory basically as the challenges we expect to face, and then how we plan to overcome those challenges during operations. And so sometimes it's used interchangeably with operational concept. But there are other people in writing articles and professional dialogue where they have sort of different, I think, approaches to how they're going to define what a theory of victory is. For doctrine purposes, the theory of victory is going to be as precise as the way you define the challenges and the threat. So our guidance for FM30 was China and Russia, peer threats, that's the focus. But obviously we'd have to fight China differently than we fight Russia. So that prevents us really from drilling down into a level of detail that I think a lot of people would like to see in the theory of victory. And if we focused on one specific threat, we would be able to do that. So the whole book is really, all of FM30 is really the theory of victory. But we did kind of summarize it in ADP30 this time in describing what the challenges are during each of the Army strategic contexts: competition below armed conflict, crisis, and armed conflict, and then how Army forces overcome the challenges and succeed during each of those contexts. And I think, as we continue, the ideas continue to mature, as we continue to validate concepts, as we continue to add specificity to how we define the environment and the threat, we will add specificity to the theory of victory.
Gentlemen, any final thoughts?
So we're listening. Please do reach out to us. All of the revisions that we made in this 2025 version came from somebody reaching out via an email, a phone call, writing an article. Okay, we're listening to all kinds of feedback. And even if you think your feedback maybe isn't perfect, or you're not maybe a doctrine expert, but you've got some relevant experience, we're listening to all that feedback too. All that matters. All that goes in is taken in and combined with other feedback we get. And very often we'll get 3 or 4 disparate sets of advice, bits of advice, but they all kind of relate to the same thing. And then that becomes an update in doctrine. So please do reach out to us directly. We welcome all discussions and professional discourse.
Yeah, because we have to let people know that we're always available to talk them through it. if something doesn't make sense, if something needs clarity, if leaders are confused, interpretation required, we have a team inbox, a group email account, and it's used quite frequently, but probably not as much as we would like to interact with you and to give you that clarity. We're always available to discuss and clarify.
And Scott, you had mentioned about doctrine going fast. So the other point that I had on that was, even though doctrine may be perceived as going slow, units don't have to wait on doctrine. If they see a gap, work on that gap and provide us feedback and put that into the lessons learned. This is how we are solving this gap, because we read all those reports, lessons learned from the units, and whatever's stored at the Center for Army's Lessons Learned. Again, it's the good units that are not waiting on doctrine to be updated to explore how can we solve this gap with our current force structure and our current capabilities. And that is what drives changes to doctrine.
Yeah, good units are always ahead of doctrine. Doctrine is built by the actions of and insights of good units.
Well, that about wraps it up for this Breaking Doctrine podcast. Thanks for joining us today. Just like writing new doctrine is a team effort, Breaking Doctrine takes a team. Without the crew and special doctrine division here at CADD, we wouldn't be able to bring you this show. Please don't forget to subscribe on Amazon Music, Apple, Odyssey, Audible, Spotify, or YouTube. Also, please follow us on social media at U.S. Army Doctrine to get updates on new podcasts, Doctrine Digest videos, and publications. Finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I am Major Scott McMahan, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.